There are moments in history when the world holds its breath, when the tectonic plates of geopolitical power shift so dramatically, so rapidly, that analysts struggle to keep pace with the sheer scale of what is unfolding. This is one of those moments. What is happening right now in the Middle East, in the skies above Tehran, along the coastlines of the Persian Gulf, deep within the military and intelligence infrastructure of the Islamic Republic of Iran, represents a transformation of historic proportions. The United States military, operating alongside Israeli forces as part of a coalition campaign of extraordinary precision and firepower, has now struck more than 10,000 military targets inside Iran and across the broader region. 10,000. That number alone demands pause. That is not a skirmish. That is not a limited retaliatory strike. That is a sustained, coordinated, and devastatingly effective military campaign that has, according to the head of United States Central Command, damaged or destroyed more than 2/3 of Iran's missile production facilities, drone manufacturing infrastructure, naval production yards, and shipyards. 92% of Iran's naval capability has been knocked out. 12 of the most senior and powerful leaders of the Iranian regime, including the supreme leader, the Ayatollah himself, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is gone. The defense minister, the commander of the Basij, the head of Iranian intelligence, all of them eliminated. What the world is witnessing right now may very well be the end of the Islamic Republic of Iran as it has existed for nearly half a century, and the questions that follow from that reality are among the most consequential any generation of Americans has ever been asked to consider. The headline out of Central Command is as stark as it is staggering. United States forces have conducted more than 10,000 combat flights targeting Iranian military infrastructure, and commanders confirm that the milestone of 10,000 Iranian targets struck was passed hours ago, with operations continuing. General Michael Kurilla, the head of United States Central Command, delivered the assessment with measured precision, noting that strikes have had, in his words, tangible effects. The damage assessment reveals a military machine that has been systematically dismantled. More than 2/3 of Iran's missile, drone, and naval production facilities and shipyards have been damaged or destroyed. 92% of the Iranian Navy has been knocked out of operational capacity. The head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, the commander who was personally responsible for the Iranian blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, has been killed, and 12 of the top leadership figures of the entire Iranian regime, from the supreme leader to the commanders of the security services that have long kept the Iranian population under brutal repression, have been eliminated. Meanwhile, the Iranian military's capacity to strike back is visibly diminishing. While American military bases throughout the region have been targeted over the past 3 to 4 weeks by Iranian drones and missiles, the frequency and intensity of those retaliatory strikes is declining by the day. Fewer drones, fewer missiles, a regime firing back with diminishing returns. To understand the full weight of what is happening, one must understand what Iran has represented on the world stage for the last 47 years, and why the conditions inside that country today may be more volatile, more ripe for fundamental change than at any point since the Islamic Revolution itself upended the Persian Gulf and remade the Middle East in 1979. The Islamic Revolution that brought Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini to power was born from a particular set of conditions. A government under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi that had grown deeply unpopular, prioritizing military strength and external prestige while neglecting the economic needs of its own people. When the moment of reckoning came, the Shah's security forces, the very apparatus upon which his power depended, one by wavered. Many stayed home, others defected. The institutional loyalty that sustains any authoritarian government simply collapsed under the weight of popular discontent and elite fragmentation. Retired General H.R. McMaster, the former National Security Advisor to President Donald Trump and one of the most respected strategic minds in American military and foreign policy circles, made a striking observation in recent commentary. The conditions inside Iran today are not merely similar to those of 1979. They are, in his assessment, worse for the current regime than those conditions were for the Shah in the months before the revolution swept him from power. That is a remarkable statement from a man of McMaster's background and analytical rigor. And when examined alongside the battlefield developments now being reported by Central Command, it carries enormous weight. The Islamic Republic that emerged from 1979 was built on a specific ideological foundation. The concept of velayat-e-faqih, or guardianship of the Islamic jurist, which placed supreme political and religious authority in the hands of a senior cleric, the supreme leader. For the first decade of the Republic, that position was held by Khomeini himself, the architect of the revolution. Upon his death in 1989, Ali Khamenei assumed the role, a position he held for more than 3 decades, becoming one of the most enduring authoritarian figures in modern Middle Eastern history. Under Khamenei's leadership, Iran developed a foreign policy doctrine built explicitly on regional hegemony, proxy warfare, and existential hostility to the United States and Israel. The regime funded and directed Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, and various Shia militia forces in Iraq and Syria. It developed one of the most sophisticated ballistic missile programs in the developing world and pursued a nuclear enrichment program that brought it into sustained conflict with the international community. And it used the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes, as a geopolitical pressure point, threatening to close it whenever tensions escalated with the West. That is the strategic architecture that American and Israeli forces have now spent weeks systematically dismantling. The 12 senior Iranian leaders whose deaths have been confirmed represent the decapitation of an entire institutional command structure. The Ayatollah, the supreme leader himself, is dead, eliminating the single most powerful figure in the Islamic Republic and the theological linchpin of the entire system of governance. The head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the elite military force that serves as both the regime's external power projection tool and its internal enforcement mechanism, has been taken out. The head of the military bureau is dead, the defense minister is gone, the commander of the Basij, the paramilitary force responsible for some of the most brutal acts of domestic repression in Iran's recent history, including the killing of more than 30,000 Iranians in a 2-day period in January alone, has been eliminated. The head of Iranian intelligence, the man who ran the apparatus of surveillance and terror that kept the Iranian population in a state of fear, is gone. What remains is a regime that is, in the words of General McMaster, fundamentally fragmented. President Trump himself has acknowledged the disorienting reality of this fragmentation, noting publicly that the United States does not know with certainty who it is negotiating with because the power structure on the Iranian side has been so thoroughly disrupted. The political dimensions of this campaign extend far beyond the immediate military calculus. What is unfolding in the skies above Tehran and across the Persian Gulf is not simply a military operation. It is a geopolitical realignment of the First Order, one that carries implications for every major power relationship in the Middle East and beyond. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, have watched Iranian regional aggression with mounting alarm for decades. They have funded proxy conflicts, absorbed Iranian-backed missile strikes, and lived under the shadow of a nuclear program that could, if completed, fundamentally alter the balance of power in their neighborhood. What American officials have heard from the leaders of those Gulf states is unambiguous. They cannot accept an Iran that has not been, in their terminology, neutered. They want Iran's military capabilities comprehensively dismantled, and they want any successor government to formally agree to conditions that preclude the kind of regional adventurism that has defined the Islamic Republic since 1979. The specific conditions being referenced by President Trump and others include a permanent cessation of attacks on American forces and allies, a binding commitment never to attack American interests again, the formal transfer of control over the Strait of Hormuz, and the payment of reparations for damage caused by Iranian-backed attacks over the course of the conflict. Those are sweeping demands, the kind of terms typically associated not with a ceasefire, but with the end of a war and the dissolution of a hostile regime's capacity to threaten its neighbors. The economic dimensions of this conflict are equally significant and in some respects even more immediately consequential for global markets and everyday Americans. The Strait of Hormuz, which Iranian naval forces attempted to blockade in the early stages of this conflict, is the single most important choke point in global energy markets. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply, including the vast majority of energy exports from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, Kuwait, and Iran itself, passes through that narrow strait every day. Any sustained closure of the Strait of Hormuz would send global oil prices into historic territory, triggering inflationary pressures across every economy on Earth. The fact that the Iranian commander responsible for the Hormuz blockade has been killed, and that 92% of the Iranian Navy has been knocked out, represents not merely a military achievement, but a significant stabilization of global energy markets. The elimination of Iran's capacity to threaten that choke point removes what has been for decades one of the most potent weapons in the Iranian strategic arsenal. For American consumers facing energy costs, for businesses dependent on stable fuel prices, and for the global economy more broadly, the implications of a permanently open and secure Strait of Hormuz are enormously positive. That said, the uncertainty surrounding what comes next in Iran, the question of who ultimately assumes power in the wake, the kind of regime decapitation, introduces its own set of economic unknowns that markets will be watching with intense scrutiny in the weeks and months ahead. Socially and demographically, the situation inside Iran is one of profound tension and potentially historic possibility. Iran is a country with a young, educated, and deeply frustrated population, one that has repeatedly demonstrated its desire for a different kind of governance through protest movements that the regime has met with extraordinary violence. The Green Movement of 2009, the 2019 protests over fuel prices that were met with a brutal crackdown, the 2022 uprising triggered by the death of Mahsa Amini in morality police custody. Each of these movements represented a population straining against the constraints of a theocratic authoritarian system. The regime's response to each uprising was the same: mass arrests, internet shutdowns, and lethal force. The Basij paramilitary force, whose commander has now been killed in the current campaign, was the primary instrument of that repression, responsible for some of the most horrific acts of violence against Iranian civilians in the Republic's history, including the killing of more than 30,000 people in a single two-day period. The regime, aware of the threat posed by its own population, has most recently rounded up 1,000 individuals in a preemptive attempt to suppress any organized response to the deteriorating military situation. That kind of desperate preventive detention is itself a telling indicator of the regime's fear of its own people. On the legal and constitutional dimensions of this conflict, the operation raises significant questions under both American and international law, questions that are likely to occupy legal scholars, members of Congress, and international legal bodies for years to come. The United States has not formally declared war on Iran, yet the scale and duration of military operations, more than 10,000 targets struck, more than 10,000 combat flights conducted, far exceeds What has historically been justified under the War Powers Resolution of 1973 without explicit congressional authorization. The Trump administration has framed the operation within the broader context of presidential authority as commander-in-chief and the inherent right of self-defense, pointing to Iranian attacks on American military bases throughout the region over the preceding 3 to 4 weeks as the legal justification for the sustained campaign. Congressional reaction has been divided along broadly partisan lines, with some members calling for a formal authorization for use of military force and others supporting the executive's approach. International law scholars will also examine whether the targeted killing of senior government officials, including the supreme leader of a sovereign state, constitutes acts of war under the United Nations Charter and what precedents those actions set for future conflicts. Internationally, the reaction to this campaign has been as varied as the interests at stake. American allies in Europe, while largely silent publicly, have been engaged in intensive diplomatic consultations. NATO partners face a delicate balancing act, supporting American strategic interests in a region where energy security is directly tied to European economic stability, while managing domestic political pressures from populations wary of escalation and broader regional conflict. Russia and China, both of which have cultivated relationships with Tehran and used Iranian regional influence as a counterweight to American power, are watching the collapse of a major strategic partner with evident alarm. Pakistan's role has emerged as particularly notable, with Pakistani leadership publicly acknowledging that Iran has at least examined the terms of the American offer, even as Iran's own public communications have rejected negotiations entirely. That gap between what Iran says publicly for domestic consumption and what it is actually doing diplomatically is, in General McMaster's assessment, a function of regime fragmentation and propaganda, not genuine strategic confidence. General H.R. McMaster's analytical framework for understanding the current moment deserves particular attention, given both his intellectual credentials and his direct experience at the highest levels of American national security decision-making. McMaster served as National Security Advisor from February 2017 to April 2018, bringing to that role a distinguished military career that included command at every level, a PhD in military history from the University of North Carolina, and authorship of the landmark work, Dereliction of Duty, a rigorous examination of the failures of American military and political leadership during the Vietnam War. His assessment that the Islamic Republic is, in his words, a dead man. Crawling is not the language of a commentator seeking attention. It is the carefully chosen formulation of a strategist who has spent a career studying how regimes maintain and lose power. His comparison to 1979 is grounded in a specific analytical observation, the same structural conditions that undermined the Shah, a government that prioritized military projection over economic welfare, security forces that are unwilling or unable to sustain their loyalty, and a population that has lost faith in the system are present in Iran today, arguably in more acute form. Political analysts broadly note that McMaster's framework aligns with a growing consensus among regional experts that the Islamic Republic is approaching a structural breaking point, though the precise form that transition takes remains deeply uncertain. The question of what comes after the Islamic Republic is the one that is simultaneously most important and most difficult to answer. McMaster outlined several possible trajectories in his analysis, each with distinct implications for regional stability and American interests. The first, and, in his assessment, most favorable outcome would be a military coup of sorts, a scenario in which elements of the conventional Iranian military, distinct from the IRGC and its ideological commitments, decide that the cost of continued resistance has become unacceptable and effectively take control, establishing a transitional government that could negotiate a new relationship with the United States and the international community. That scenario has historical precedents in other post-authoritarian transitions and would offer the clearest path to a negotiated settlement of outstanding issues, including the nuclear program, regional proxy networks, and reparations. The second scenario involves continued targeted strikes against the Basij and other repressive apparatus, gradually weakening the regime's capacity to suppress its own population until popular uprising becomes viable. The third and most volatile scenario involves a period of what McMaster described as essentially civil war, a breakdown of central authority, competing power centers fighting for control, and the kind of chaotic transition that carries enormous risks of humanitarian crisis, regional instability, and the potential for dangerous actors to exploit the power vacuum. The information environment inside Iran is itself a critical variable in how this situation develops. The regime has long maintained control over domestic communications, shutting down the internet during periods of unrest and relying on state media to shape the narrative that reaches ordinary Iranians. In the current crisis, that strategy appears to be straining at its seams. Virtual private networks, VPNs, are proliferating inside Iran, allowing citizens to bypass the state's digital firewalls and access outside information. Starlink terminals, the satellite internet technology developed by SpaceX, are reportedly being used inside the country to maintain connectivity that the regime cannot easily interrupt. The result is a situation in which the regime's public claims that it is successfully resisting, that the strikes are not as damaging as reported, that negotiations are not happening, are increasingly difficult to sustain against a population that is finding alternative routes to the truth. The public statements from Iranian officials rejecting any talks, dismissing the American offer, and proclaiming continued resistance are, in General McMaster's assessment, total propaganda directed at a domestic audience that is becoming harder and harder to keep isolated from reality. The pattern of Iranian retaliatory strikes against American bases in Israeli territory provides one of the clearest indicators of the trajectory of this conflict. Over the past 3 to 4 weeks, American bases throughout the region have been targeted repeatedly by Iranian drones and missiles. Strikes that have been largely intercepted and defeated by American and allied air defense systems, but which represent a sustained effort by Tehran to impose costs and signal continued resistance. What the most recent data shows, however, is that the volume and intensity of those retaliatory strikes is declining measurably. Fewer drones, fewer missiles. The strikes that are being launched are being detected and defeated with increasing ease. 3 strikes have landed in or near Israel. 1 strike occurred near Baghdad, another in Kuwait. But the overall trend line is unmistakable. By the day, the Iranian fire is diminishing. That decline is a direct function of the degradation of Iran's production capacity. You cannot sustain a campaign of drone and missile strikes when 2/3 of your production facilities have been destroyed and your navy has been knocked out. The military math is brutal and simple. Looking ahead, the coming days and weeks will be defined by several critical variables and decision points. On the diplomatic front, the question of whether a coherent interlocutor emerges on the Iranian side, someone with both the authority and the willingness to engage seriously with the 5 conditions that President Trump has outlined, will be determinative. The conditions, as publicly stated, include a permanent halt to attacks on American and allied forces, a binding commitment against future attacks, formal resolution of the Strait of Hormuz question, and payment of reparations. Those are demanding terms, and even a fragmented regime may struggle to formally accept them without some face-saving formulation. The role of intermediaries, Pakistan, Oman, and other regional actors with lines of communication to Tehran will be critical in whatever diplomatic process unfolds. On the military side, the question of whether strikes continue and what their targets are will shape the conditions on the ground. Continued strikes against the Basij and internal security apparatus would accelerate the weakening of the regime's capacity for domestic repression, potentially opening space for the kind of popular uprising or military coup that McMaster described. Continued strikes against whatever remains of Iran's missile and drone production capacity would further degrade retaliatory capability. And the nuclear question, Iran's uranium enrichment program, and the facilities associated with it, looms over everything as perhaps the most consequential, unresolved issue of the entire campaign. What the world is witnessing in real time is something without modern precedent in the American experience of warfare and geopolitics. The United States military, in partnership with Israel and with the acquiescence, if not the active support of the Gulf states, has in a matter of weeks done more to reshape the strategic landscape of the Middle East than decades of diplomacy, sanctions, and limited military action managed to achieve. 12 of the most powerful figures in one of the most entrenched authoritarian regimes in the world are dead. The military machine that made Iran a regional power, its navy, its missile forces, its drone production, has been devastated. The security apparatus that kept 40 million Iranians under the boot of a theocratic dictatorship has been decapitated. And the ideological system that sustained all of it, the revolutionary fervor, the anti-American propaganda, the promise of resistance and martyrdom, is being tested against a reality that no amount of state media can fully conceal. General McMaster's formulation of a dead man crawling captures something essential about this moment, a regime that retains the outward form of authority, but has been so fundamentally damaged that its continued existence in its current form is no longer viable. The questions of what comes next, who leads the transition, and how the international community manages the aftermath of this extraordinary moment will occupy statesmen, analysts, military planners, and historians for decades to come. But the first chapter of that story is being written right now, in the skies above Tehran and the waters of the Persian Gulf, in a campaign that has already changed the world. This has been a comprehensive look at the dramatic and rapidly evolving military situation between the United States, Israel, and Iran. A story of historic dimensions that this broadcast will continue to follow closely as events develop. The facts on the ground are changing by the hour. The strategic implications will unfold over years. What is certain is that the world on the other side of this conflict will look very different from the one we have known. Stay with us for continuing coverage.